All right, so are you ready to jump into a time machine? Today we're going deep into the history of Indonesia.
Yeah, we're going to trace those key events that shaped the nation and, especially its relationship with China, which has been pretty complex.
Definitely complex. I mean, over 17,000 islands, so many different languages and cultures, fighting for independence, all this political drama. We've even got some panda diplomacy later on. It's going to be wild.
You'll come away understanding how Indonesia became what it is today.
For sure. And probably some trivia night winners too.
Well, we got to start with the basics, right? Indonesia, it's an archipelago that's shaped everything about its development. Can you imagine trying to unite all those islands and cultures under one national identity?
That's a lot of islands to unite, yeah.
Now, fast forward to the early 1900s, and Indonesia is under Dutch colonial rule, which, sets the stage for the rise of Indonesian nationalism.
Right, centuries of being ruled by someone else is bound to make you want to, rule yourself.
Exactly. And then World War II hits, things get even more complicated.
1942, Japan occupies Indonesia. Right. It's kind of weird how sometimes conflict can, accidentally create opportunities.
It is. The Japanese occupation, obviously brutal, but it unintentionally helped the Indonesian independence movement.
How?
They trained and armed Indonesian nationalists to, fight against the Dutch, didn't realize they were sowing the seeds of their own defeat in the region.
Wow. So 1945, World War II ends. Indonesia takes the chance, declares independence. But, of course, the Dutch weren't just going to walk away.
Nope. 4-year revolution, pivotal moment, intense fighting, lots of negotiation, and finally in 1949, Indonesia gets its full independence.
Huge victory for the Indonesian people, no doubt.
Absolutely. And then comes Sukarno, Indonesia's first president, charismatic, controversial. What did he want for this new nation?
Sukarno, yeah, he was a complicated figure for sure.
He was navigating those first years of independence, using politics. He favored socialist economics, tough job, uniting a nation that's still figuring out its identity.
Yeah. And all this is happening during the Cold War, right? Did that impact Indonesia's internal politics?
Oh, for sure. There were 3 main forces at play: nationalists, Islamists, and the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, each with their own ideas for the country's future, and Sukarno trying to balance them all.
Sounds like a recipe for tension, for sure.
It was. Then in '59, Sukarno declares guided democracy, which, what does that even mean?
Yeah, I was going to ask. The guided democracy sounds a bit contradictory.
Basically, Sukarno consolidated power, became more authoritarian, argued that Western democracy wouldn't work for Indonesia.
Interesting, rejecting those Western models and looking elsewhere for inspiration.
Exactly. He turned toward communist countries, saw them as allies against imperialism, and that's when the relationship with China really takes off.
This is where it gets interesting, right?
Big time. In 1955, they signed this treaty on dual nationality for Chinese Indonesians. Huge implications for both countries.
Treaty on dual nationality. Okay, break that down for us.
Well, there were lots of ethnic Chinese living in Indonesia, complicated citizenship issues. The treaty let them choose Indonesian or Chinese citizenship, meant to strengthen ties, acknowledge contributions of the Chinese-Indonesian community.
I see. Even something as, technical as citizenship can get so political, especially for a new country trying to define who they are.
It's true, and it shows the lasting impact of colonialism, right? The Dutch had set up this system pitting different groups against each other, and those divisions didn't just disappear with independence.
So you've got these Cold War tensions, internal political struggles, and the ghost of colonialism. What could go wrong?
Well, in 1965, everything changes. A failed coup attempt called the G30S throws Indonesia into chaos, and things are never really the same again.
Okay, the G30S coup, that's a turning point we need to dig into. Yeah. Who was involved, what went down?
It's complex, still debated even today. Some military officers claim they were trying to stop a right-wing coup, so they kidnapped and killed 6 high-ranking army generals.
Oh, wow. That's a lot to unpack there.
It is. Details are murky, lots of theories about who was really behind it, what their motives were. The aftermath of the G30S, man, it was fast and brutal. The army, led by General Suharto, they took control back quickly, and then they started this huge crackdown on anyone they suspected of being communist, even just sympathizers.
It's crazy how this story changed so fast. The army just blamed the PKI for the whole thing, even though there wasn't much evidence, and then used that to justify this massive purge.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really, really tragic. It was killings, imprisonment, often without any trial or anything. Hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, killed or just disappeared. It's a dark time in Indonesian history and still a very sensitive topic.
And it's scary how the violence it didn't stop with just the PKI. It went after anyone who seemed leftist, intellectuals, ethnic Chinese, even people who weren't political at all.
Right, the violence just spread way beyond those first targets. It was fueled by fear, propaganda, and those social tensions that were already there. It shows how quickly a society can fall apart when people are scared and suspicious.
So China, who had been so close to Sukarno and the PKI, they become the scapegoat now, huh? It's like the complete opposite of what we saw just a few years before.
Totally. Indonesia cuts ties with China completely. Chinese language and culture are suppressed. The Chinese-Indonesian community, they'd been part of Indonesia for centuries, and suddenly they're pushed aside, marginalized.
This upheaval, this is what lets Suharto take over and we enter the New Order era. A huge shift for Indonesia, wouldn't you say?
Massive shift. Suharto, he was the strong man after the coup. He becomes president officially in '67, and his rule, it lasts over 30 years. That's a long time. It's marked by authoritarianism, but also economic development and being totally anti-communist.
Suharto's New Order sounds like a whole different plan from Sukarno. What were the main things about this new regime?
Suharto, he was all about stability and economic growth above everything else. He got foreign investment, especially from the West and Japan, and his policies actually did lead to a lot of economic progress. Indonesia, under him, went from being really poor to a rising economic power in Southeast Asia.
So it seems like Suharto brought some prosperity and order to Indonesia. But like you said earlier, there was a darker side to his rule, too.
There was, yeah. Suharto's government, it did well with the economy, but it was very authoritarian. He controlled everything, silenced any opposition, censorship, threats, jailing people. Basic freedoms were gone, and if you challenged him, you'd be met with, well, repression, sometimes brutal.
So even the Islamists who had helped the army take down the PKI, even they got pushed aside under the New Order.
Yeah, Suharto saw any challenge to his power as a threat, didn't matter what you believed in. He did bring some Islamic groups into his government, but he was always watching them, worried they might turn against him.
Classic case of power consolidating itself, right?
Yeah.
Once the shared enemy is gone, all the internal divisions and rivalries come back.
Exactly. You see this pattern through Indonesian history. These different groups, they might come together for a common goal, but then they're always fighting for power, constantly shifting and maneuvering.
Suharto, he managed to keep that going for over 30 years. That's incredible for any leader. But even the strongest regimes can fall apart. What caused Suharto's New Order to crumble in the end?
In the late 90s, a bunch of things happened all at once, and it weakened Suharto's hold on power. The Asian financial crisis, it hit Indonesia really hard, exposed how weak its economy actually was, and that led to widespread social unrest.
I remember reading about that crisis. It was a global thing. How did it specifically impact Indonesia, and how did it lead to Suharto stepping down?
The Indonesian rupiah, their currency, it crashed. Inflation went through the roof, unemployment everywhere. People were angry, frustrated, and they started protesting, demanding political and economic reforms.
And it's so sad how, once again, the Chinese-Indonesian community became a target. They were blamed and attacked. It seems like this happens over and over in Indonesian history.
It does, and it's heartbreaking. It shows how deep those prejudices and social divisions are, even when people try to promote unity and tolerance. When things get bad, those tensions come right back to the surface, and minorities get scapegoated and attacked.
So after over 3 decades in power, Suharto resigns in 1998. He couldn't ignore the protests and the divisions in his own government anymore. What did this moment mean for Indonesia?
Suharto leaving, it was the end of an era, but it was also the start of something totally new. Indonesia, after all those years under an authoritarian rule, was suddenly on the path to democracy, a path with lots of challenges, but also opportunities.
This change to democracy, after so long under authoritarianism, it must have been really difficult and chaotic. What were the biggest challenges for Indonesia in this new era?
Well, they had to deal with everything Suharto had left behind. The human rights abuses, the corruption, the culture of fear and silence. People wanted justice, accountability, but they also needed reconciliation to heal the nation.
And this is where people like Abdurrahman Wahid and Megawati Sukarnoputri, Sukarno's daughter, they entered the scene. They both played huge roles in shaping post-Suharto Indonesia.
Thigir Wahid, he was a well-known Islamic scholar, a big advocate for democracy. He became Indonesia's first democratically elected president in 1999. He was all about pluralism and human rights, and importantly, he ended the ban on Chinese language and culture, a symbolic step toward bringing everyone back together.
That must have been a huge moment for the Chinese-Indonesian community after all those years of being pushed aside.
It was a big sign of inclusion, acknowledging their contributions to Indonesia. But Wahid's time as president, it was short. He was impeached in 2001, lots of political turmoil, accusations of him not being competent.
And that's when Megawati Sukarnoputri, Sukarno's daughter, takes over.
Yeah.
What did she do for Indonesia's transition to democracy?
Megawati, she was a symbol of her father's era, so she brought some sense of continuity to things. She kept going with the democratic reforms, but she struggled with the complicated politics and the lingering effects of that economic crisis.
So Indonesia is trying to figure out this democracy thing, dealing with its past, trying to build a future that's fairer for everyone. But there are still obstacles, right?
Oh, definitely Indonesia, even though it's moving towards democracy, it's still got major challenges. Separatist movements are still happening, the economy isn't stable, and hardline Islamist groups are getting more influential. It's a test for Indonesia's commitment to pluralism and tolerance.
Sound like they're walking a tightrope, trying to keep everyone happy, build a national identity, but also respect all the different groups.
Exactly. And it's in this messy, ever-changing landscape that the fight between secular nationalists and Islamists gets worse. And this is what sets the stage for a new generation of leaders, people like Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, as he's known.
Okay, so we've seen Indonesia go through all this change, independence, political struggles, authoritarian rule, then this shift to democracy. Where does China fit into all of this? Their relationship has been kind of a roller coaster, right?
It really has. After they froze things, after the 65 coup, things started thawing out again in the late 80s, early 90s, mainly because of, practical economic reasons.
Makes sense. China was becoming a major economic force, and Indonesia, they've got tons of natural resources, a growing market. It was an opportunity China wouldn't want to miss.
Exactly. And for Indonesia, China was a potential investor trade partner, especially as they wanted to branch out, not rely on just a few countries.
So how did this re-engagement go? Did they just ignore the past and act like nothing happened?
Not exactly. There was still some caution, distrust on both sides. History leaves its mark, but they also realized they could both benefit from working together.
So they started slow, focused on economics, but then things became more official politically.
Right. In 2005, they signed a strategic partnership agreement. Then in 2013, they upgraded it to a comprehensive strategic partnership. It meant their ties were getting stronger, they had a shared vision for the region, stability, development, all that.
But I'm guessing some people in Indonesia were still worried about China's influence growing, especially with all that anti-Chinese sentiment in the past.
Oh yeah, definitely. There were, and still are, concerns about relying too much on China economically and whether China might try to use that for political leverage.
So how did China try to deal with that? Did they pull out all the stops, big displays of friendship?
Well, this is where China's soft power comes in. More cultural exchanges, scholarships for Indonesian students to study in China, and even, remember those pandas, Kai Tao and Hu Chun, arriving in 2017?
Ah, yes, the panda diplomacy. Can't say no to those cute faces. But was it really just about cute animals, or was there a strategy behind it?
It's definitely part of a bigger plan to make China look good in Indonesia, build up some goodwill with the people.
So it's not just pandas. It's about changing perceptions, making those relationships stronger on a, personal level.
Exactly. China's investing in people-to-people diplomacy, hoping that'll make it easier to achieve their economic and political goals.
Has it worked? Have they won over the Indonesian people?
That's a tough one. China's economic influence has grown a lot, that's for sure, and their cultural presence is more visible. But there's still suspicion, concerns, things they need to address.
So it's a work in progress. This whole Indonesia-China relationship, it's fascinating. A mix of pragmatism, historical baggage, and wanting a better future together.
And it'll keep changing, that's for sure. As China gets more powerful globally, the relationship with Indonesia is going to be more and more important, not just for them, but for the whole region.
It feels like we've just scratched the surface here. What stands out to you as the most important thing we learned from this deep dive into Indonesian history?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Indonesia's story is one of resilience, adapting, and always changing. They've gone through so much: colonialism, political chaos, natural disasters, but they always find a way to get through it, come out stronger on the other side.
It reminds us that history isn't just dates and events, it's alive. It shapes who we are today and what we might become tomorrow.
Absolutely. And we focused on the big picture, but there are so many individual stories out there, different perspectives, connections waiting to be made.
Exactly. And we want you to keep digging deeper. What parts of Indonesian history really caught your attention? What questions do you still have? Let us know. And until next time, keep exploring.